During your speech, what particularly caught my attention is when you told the story of taking the train.
Yes.
And I thought it was a great example of how far we've come.
Oh, yes.
Would you mind briefly?
Yes. Well, in
specific to
right. One of not so much now, but back during the 40s and 50s and probably into the 60s, black families a lot of times would send their children back down south, for the summer, to run off all that energy. You go down to the rural areas where your family originally was from. Like, we would go down to my cousin Johnny and Martha's farm. My family was from Gainesville, Georgia. But I can remember in the early 60s, this might be like 1961, 1962, we got on a train called the Silver Meteor. It still runs along the East Coast. We got on that train at Penn Station in Newark. And when we got to Washington, D.C., the conductor told us that we had to move out of the car that we were in into the cars at the rear of the train. And this was an experience that many African Americans had. And we had this experience in Washington, D.C., because Washington, D.C. sat on the Mason-Dixon line. When you went through Washington, that's when the laws of segregated interstate travel came into effect. So I was trying to find out from my mother why we had to move. It was never really explained to me. And that's another thing. I didn't come up in a family where we talked a lot about racial issues. In fact, we really didn't start having serious discussions. One, probably because I was a kid. But two, when the Newark uprising occurred, the Newark rebellions, which are called the Newark riots, we lived right in the middle of the community where the riots broke out. So that was when the first serious discussions about race occurred in my family. When I was old enough to engage the adults in my family in conversation, because I was 12 or 13 at that time. And that's when my own grandfather told me, because my father passed when I was 4. So when my father passed, my mother went back to live with her parents. So I was in an extended family, my grandmother's sister, cousin Ralph. I had like 5 adults in the house. But, my grandfather told me about how when he served in World War II, when he went abroad, he went to France, the French people would ask to see his tail because the white soldiers had told them that black soldiers had tails. So the white people would come up to him in France and ask to see his tail, and I was like, wow, because, my grandfather, we had never talked about these things before.
Can you recall your earliest experience with being discriminated against, and maybe at what age that might have happened?
Well, I think probably the first clear experience was on the train, when we had to change cars in Washington. That's one I will never forget. But the other thing is to keep in mind that I grew up in an all-black community. And you can be in that situation and never actually interact with white people. I remember the first white person's home that I went into was my 8th grade teacher. Her name was Miss Ryerson, and she invited me to have dinner with her and her friend in her apartment in the Colonnades in Newark, which was in the North Ward. The North Ward of Newark was mostly white at that time. And then I wasn't in another white person's home until my humanities teacher, Mrs. Rich, at Arts High School, she invited us to her home. I believe she lived either in Livingston or in Short Hills. And that's when I really began to see the difference, and was conscious enough to say, wow, this is how this population lives, and this is how we live, So I began to become conscious, as an adolescent, in my teenage years.
I read an interview with you where you said that as bad and tragic as the Newark riots were, there also was a sense of hope that came out of it.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. We thought, remember, the Black Power movement was made possible by the Civil Rights movement. One grows out of the other. Civil rights movement grew out of the struggle against Jim Crow, and the Black Power, and one of the achievements of the Civil Rights movement was the Voting Rights Act. And it's interesting, when you read the Voting Rights Act of 1965, the areas that are cited by the Justice Department are not just in the South. There are places in the North, including New York City. So the Voting Rights Act empowered many African Americans and other people of color, gave them the right to vote. In 1966, there was something like 475 black elected officials. By 1972, there were over 10,000. Over 10,000. So in Newark, whereas in the South, the struggle was against Jim Crow. Jim Crow fell, what the remnants of Jim Crow fell rather easily, and then the struggle in the North, in cities like Newark and New York, and Detroit, the struggle was to get political power. For instance, Newark was an all-black city, didn't have any black representatives until the early 1960s. They elected Irvin Turner, the first black councilman of the Central Ward of Newark. But that was before the passage, that was before 1965. So after 1965, by 1970, Newark elects its first black mayor. And so people had hope. You know, they believed that through the ballot, if they could just get access, we would elect people, put people in office who would treat us right, who would fairly distribute the resources. But then, you know, it's a learning process. By the time a lot of blacks did get political power in a lot of these cities, there were no resources left to distribute. So it was a catch-22, you know. But yes, it was a time of hope. When Ken Gibson was elected in 1970, people literally danced down Broad Street to the Robert Treat Hotel. You know, literally were dancing because, you know, we had thrown off the old regime and we were putting in a new regime, and we thought naively, but not. It was naive, but it's a kind of naivete that comes from having an honest heart. You know, we had seen how other immigrant groups, white ethnics, Irish, Jews, Italians, had used the ballot and used control of municipal government to distribute resources to their communities. And we thought that if we did the same thing, the outcome would be the same, but it didn't quite work out that way. The roots of poverty and racism and economic inequality were much deeper. And see, that's the real accomplishment of the civil rights movement, was to remove the veneer of race. Because at first blush, people would look at their problems and they would think, well, the real root of this is racism. So let's remove all the laws of racial separation. And we did that. But then we found, after pulling back that veneer, that the real roots were economic. And that's the challenge that faces us today, the economic inequality and the super inequality that African Americans endure, the super economic inequality that we endure because of racism and institutional racism. So it's compounded. So not only are we struggling because we're poor and because we're working class, but also because we're black, we face racial discrimination in the labor market, harder to get hired, harder to get promoted. You don't get hired, no income. You don't get promoted, you don't have a higher income. All of this is economic in nature. And this is the challenge of the 21st century. This is what, we're trying to pick up where Martin Luther King left off, because this is what Dr. King was dealing with in 1968. In 1968, he was dealing with the Poor People's Movement, the Poor People's Campaign. They were going to march on Washington, engage in massive civil disobedience until Congress passed an Economic Bill of Rights. You can read all about that and Where Do We Go From Here, Chaos or Community. That was Dr. King's book in 1960. He wrote in 66, it was published in 67. You know, but they were gonna engage in massive civil disobedience until Congress passed an Economic Bill of Rights, which would, Economic Bill of Rights, national health care, jobs at a living wage, full employment, quality education for all children, and so on and so forth, quality, decent housing for everybody. That's what Dr. King was grappling with. And I think that on that stand, he was just as threatening to the power structure as his stand on Vietnam. Because regarding Vietnam, he was trying to reshape foreign policy, start talking about economic Bill of Rights, radical redistribution of power and wealth. You trying to change the fabric of the society in this country. So he had to go. And he had to go because people were listening to him. I mean, I could stand here and talk about economic Bill of Rights. Not a whole lot would happen. But Dr. King had the nation's ear. And not only that, there were white people who were willing to listen to him. He understood that even though he came out of the struggle for racial justice, that he came out of the historic African-American struggle for freedom, which is still ongoing, he understood that ultimately there would have to be a coalition built that would be all-inclusive, because that's what it would take to transform this country. And I think that's what got him assassinated, and that's what will get anybody in trouble, you know, if they start talking about that. You know, but that's what remains to be done, because if we don't make a fundamental change in this country, we're going to end up an advanced third world country if we don't make a fundamental change. United States used to be, its workers used to have the highest standard of living, the highest income. We're at the bottom of the list of industrialized nations now. American workers work longer hours, work harder, and take home less money than workers in Japan, in Germany, in other European countries. How can that be when we're the richest country in the world? How can we even tolerate that kind of situation? I just heard a report the other day that we're not producing, we're at the bottom of the list now in terms of producing doctors. We're the richest country in the world, but there are other countries that are producing more doctors than we're producing. That's crazy. It's irrational. We're sowing the seeds of our own destruction when we can spend trillions of dollars on adventurous foreign wars, you know, and we neglect our roads are falling apart. We got bridges falling into rivers without Hurricane Sandy. You know, it's irrational. We have to put the country back on a rational course, because the course we're on now is going to lead to the immiseration of people in this country. The middle class is all but going to disappear if we keep it. We're going to be a country of very rich people, just like the third world, a handful of very rich people, and everybody else is going to be poor. And who wants that? We can do better than that. Why should we even accept that? But, you know, if people are not aware, if they're not paying attention, if they're not politically involved, then those who want to take us in that direction, they have free reign. You know, we're where we were in 1968. That's where we are, black president notwithstanding. I mean, that's good. I voted for President Obama and voted for him the second time. But the real issue is this: it's not enough simply to change the complexion of people that are in office. The whole object is to change the quality of life, to make people's lives better. You know, that's what the object is. Electing people is just a tool to achieve that. And we caught up in the things along the way and losing sight of what the end goal is. You know.
Well, it sounds like our work is cut out for us.
Yes,
so,
I'm sorry.
Hamm, thank you so much. It's been a great honor to speak with you.
Thank you. Sorry for going on. Thank you.